Alana here from Evidence for Democracy. As we're just waiting to get underway, if you want to join the chat at the bottom of Fuse, there's a speech bubble. You can click that and join the group chat as we're just waiting to get started.
We're just expecting a few more people before we get started.
All right, my name is Alana Westwood. I'm the research coordinator with Evidence for Democracy, and thanks for coming and welcome to Evidence for Democracy's Comms for Scientists 102 media releases. This is the second in E4D's Network of Experts Communications for Scientists training series. Many of you may have been at part one. If not, and if you didn't see it, you can contact me if you'd like to see a recording of it. And we've got many more installments to go. So I'd like to introduce in a moment Carolyn Brown, who's going to be teaching us all about how to do press releases. She has a lot of experience, and I'm really excited to have her on board for this.
Hello.
But first, I just want to tell you a little bit about Evidence for Democracy, what it is that we do and why we're doing this. So as I mentioned, my name's Alana. I'm going to be moderating this session, and we also have with us Kathleen, the interim executive director. Want to introduce yourself?
Hi, yeah, sure. So I am serving as interim executive director. I think I might have had some contact with some of the people on the call. And so I'm serving as interim while Katie is on leave. So I think I have about 6 months left of this posting. And so for me, science policy is something that's new. So it's not my background and I'm not a scientist. So it's always interesting to hear scientists' take on things like comms. And so it's really fun to participate in these webinars with everybody. And so I'm really happy that I could be here. And I'm actually joining from Windsor, Ontario, whereas I'm normally based in Ottawa. So it's nice to see that we do have a good spread of people all over the country today.
All right. I'm actually joining from Lake Cowichan, British Columbia, but I'm normally from Halifax, so I traveled 3,000 kilometers for this webinar, I guess. So Evidence for Democracy. Most of you are probably familiar with E4D. Many of you are members of the network of experts, but I just wanted to tell you what it is that we do. We are a national nonprofit that advocates for evidence-based decision-making, for support for science and scientists. We do this in 3 ways. We do this through education, educating the public about the importance of using evidence in policy. We also do it through education for scientists, which this webinar series is an example of, giving comms tools to scientists that often aren't learned any other way. We do research, that's my wheelhouse. We look at government decisions and actions and evaluate support for science, how evidence is used, communication, that sort of thing. And then finally, we do issue-based campaigns on specific issues such as the independence of StatsCan, or in the past we've done health issues with Cochrane Canada to help advocate for evidence being used directly in policy. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Carolyn Brown. She has a very impressive resume. She writes for Nature, but she has done science reporting and editing and helping scientists and others learn how to communicate for many, many different organizations. I'll let her introduce herself to you and we'll get started.
Thanks very much, Alana. I'm very happy to be here with you this evening and to help many of you, I hope, get into the media news cycle and get news about your research out there. Now, I come from press releases, media releases from both sides. I both write media releases, and as a reporter, I receive a lot of media releases. So I'm kind of in the media release stream a lot of the time. Today, we're going to take a look at a lot of things about media releases, but I have some overarching objectives. The first is to help you understand why to issue a media release and when, where to send releases. And you'll notice I've got all of this before I even talk about how to write and release media release, the nuts and bolts. And we're going to be covering all of these this evening. We expect the webinar to last about an hour and a half.
Okay, so before I turn it right away to Carolyn, I'll just give you a heads up on how Fuse works a little bit, some of the functionality, and how we're going to make it interactive, because as I asked all of you to prepare something that you're interested in communicating so that we can workshop it a little bit and help refine some ideas together. So Fuse has two main ways to interact. One is raising your flag. So if you look at the bottom of the screen on the far right, there are 3 dots. That's your More menu. So if you click that, and then near the top of the menu, there's a little flag. It says Raise Your Flag. So I think, Carolyn, perhaps you have some questions for folks that they can raise their flag for.
Right. So we're going to practice raising our flags. Question number 1. If you have issued a media release in the past, please raise your flag so I can get an idea of how many people have done that.
Quite a few.
Oh yeah, I've got a few. Now, of those of you who have issued a media release in the past, how many of you have actually got a story into the media? Okay, I'm getting about half that. That's about what I'd expect. How many of you have someone on like a communications staff person associated with your organization or university who helps you with writing media releases or is available to help you with writing media releases? That kind of person is often called a public information officer or communications officer. And I've only got one. Well, for those of you who have somebody like that on staff, and if you're not sure, do check. Hopefully this webinar will help you to work more effectively with that person and understand what their needs are, and so that you can be working toward the same objectives. Want to talk about chat, Alana?
Yes, sure. So some of you have found the chat already. It's a message box at the bottom of your screen, speech bubble. If you click that, it'll bring up the chat window. Group chat is great. Feel free to group chat as we're going. It's nice to have little side conversations or talk about things you've heard. We'll be asking you to contribute some things by chat that we're going to talk about. The chat is not being recorded itself, but Kathleen and I are going to bring up things from the chat to discuss with Carolyn as we go through different examples. If you want to message us directly, there's a little plus sign above the main chat, and it says Start a Direct Chat. You can click on that, and you can select myself, Carolyn, or you can find Kathleen at the Evidence for Democracy. If you have any technical issues, contact the Evidence for Democracy one, and we'll try and get you sorted out as quickly as we can. All right, I think we're ready to go.
Thanks, Alana. And I would like to emphasize, If you participate in this webinar more, it is what you bring to it. So if you can participate, the more you can participate, the more you'll get out of it, and the more that I'll be able to give you some feedback on how to prepare a media release for your research. So we asked you in advance if you could please bring something from your research to this that might be suitable for the media. And if you don't have anything that you're currently working on, think about it this way. If you had, if your current research was all finished up and you published your fabulous paper, you'd want to issue a media release about it. And that would be one example of a media release. So we can do this a little bit kind of hypothetically if you don't have anything current that you would release to the media. So to get started, I want to talk about understanding the news cycle. To have successful media relations, you have to kind of get inside the head of the media. Now, for those of you who have attended our first webinar, some of this is a refresher of some of the material that Alana and Adam covered. But please be patient because there are some of you who may not have attended the first webinar, so I'm going to go over a little bit of that ground. Media are in competition with each other and with all that clickbait on the internet and all that kind of thing. And editors and reporters make decisions about what they're going to cover extremely quickly. They use their sense acquired over years of what their readers or viewers are interested in, and they use kind of heuristics like rules of thumb. So I would say when they look at your press release, they're going to make a decision about whether they're going to follow that up, and that decision is going to be made in less than a minute. So that's the time you have to grab their interest. And then if you hold it for a while, you have a better chance of kind of getting in there. This is one of my favorite PhD comics, the Science News Cycle. And I had some questions when you registered from some of you about how do I make sure that my story is covered accurately. We've all seen this, where a scientific paper, very cautious, very careful, comes out with a correlation, and then that slowly through the news cycle gets churned into a conclusion that would not have been sustained by the evidence. So, to understand what goes on in this, Adam pointed out in our first webinar that science is based on cautious and critical thinking, which is kind of almost the diametric opposite of what the media are based on. The media are based on conflict, on human interest, tugging the heartstrings, and social concerns. So we have to reframe what we're doing as scientists to appeal to a different kind of interest. And media stories are also necessarily imprecise. And scientists can be uncomfortable with that. I've heard several scientists say, this story came out, but it was inaccurate. And then when I take a look at it, it wasn't inaccurate, really. It wasn't wrong. It was simply simplified, or, some fine points were glossed over because the media does not have the level of precision that we have in science. And so you have to kind of understand that going in. All you're going to be able to do in a media story is get one straightforward take home message to the audience, possibly two maximum. So, given that, if you succeed in doing that, then really you've achieved your goal. So, how do you get your message into the news cycle? The short answer is the more you can meet the needs of the media, the more likely your story will be picked up. Also, the more you can meet their needs and explain clearly what you're saying in words that they understand, the more likely you will be quoted accurately and your story will not kind of lose something in translation. So, how do you do that? Well, a couple of points. First, it's quality over quantity. The media are basically barraged with releases. And, I sit here, I've got some universities that send me so many press releases, and I think, why are you sending me so many press releases? Most of them have nothing to say to me. And basically, they go in my delete box very, very quickly. So the trick is to send very targeted releases with newsworthy content. Which you might ask, what does that mean, newsworthy? So this is a little bit kind of journalism 101. I've got some hints here with a couple of illustrations. And let me ask you, what characteristics of a science story do you think would make it newsworthy? You know, what makes something newsworthy? What makes it get into the news? Does anybody have any ideas? You
Feel
just
free to
read.
chime in on the chat there.
Mm-hmm. There's no right or wrong answer. You know, you throw in some ideas, I've got some ideas. There are quite a few things that can, bring science up the kind of chain, so that people think it's worth putting in the news. Any ideas? Haven't got anything yet. Anybody? Colin, go ahead, write it in chat. Okay, Alberto says rarity of giant squids. Perhaps it was not there before. Exactly. A rare or unusual find, a real discovery is almost always news. We'll talk more about that. Anybody else? Well, I'll get started with one, but if you think of others, chime in. Timing. Timing is huge. The question people ask is why am I hearing about this now? If it's a new discovery, that's always news. The fact that it's news is that it's been discovered and we didn't know it before. Yes, a finding that directly affects people, Caitlin has suggested. Basically, anything affecting human health and safety is always news. On the timing issue, also, if your results were just published, the fact that it's published, the journal story makes it newsworthy. And there's another facet of timing called the news hook. That is, you've got some piece of research that sheds light on an issue that is already in the news, and that can become very interesting. I was thinking the other day of some examples of this. When I was at NRC Research Press, we had a paper on the genetics of turkeys that people eat, domestically raised turkeys. And we released it right about now, this time of year. And therefore it became a Thanksgiving story. And, it got on the news as that turkey on your plate. Well, we know something more about the genetics of it. So that was the news hook there, Thanksgiving. A better example is the genius person who released the findings that showed that polar bears were being affected by climate change, just as Canada was performing very badly at a climate change conference, an international climate change conference. And so the polar bear became the icon of climate change affecting Canada. And that was kind of brilliant timing as well, because it was already in the news. As we've discussed, anything affecting human health, anything affecting human history. I once had a release that was about the fact that they had discovered in the north the place where Frobisher had smelted some iron pyrites that he went back and tried to pass off as gold in Britain so he would get his trips to the Arctic financed. So that was a human history story, and that got very good pickup. Quirky, oddball discoveries. So this is a fisherman who has a colossal squid in his net, and that kind of thing gets a lot of coverage. I also got a lot of coverage one time. I had a press release on a humongous fungus, the largest mushroom ever found in the world, spread for kilometers, basically the same organism. Had another very good pickup on one about the oldest cottonwoods ever discovered that were discovered in Alberta. So things like that. Another aspect is something local. If a story affects a specific area, it is news in that area, and don't overlook that. That can be a big story in the place where it happens. But another thing to realize is that there's a difference between what's newsworthy and what's important in your field of research. the two may not be the same thing. So you may have the biggest find in your field of research for years, but unless you can translate that into something that's newsworthy, it may not be front page material. However, it might be quirks and quarks material. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. If you have a public information officer you can talk to about your research, maybe they can find a way to make it newsworthy. Now, you might have this experience. You might go into to your public information officer with all kinds of story ideas for your research that could be news, and they might shoot down the ideas that you think are brilliant, but then they might go for research that you had not considered important. And we had that happen one time. I had a bunch of stories I took to a public information officer, and the one she liked the most was one about the sex life of crickets, because at that time the Toronto Star, Peter Calamai, always covered the sex life of any animal, so we knew that was a winner. So sometimes things like that happen. Okay, now we're going to talk about some examples of what is newsworthy in science. New crab species discovered in Chinese pet market. So think about why that would be newsworthy. If you have any observations on these as they go along, why they would be newsworthy, just please write them into chat. Why would a new crab species discovered in a Chinese pet market make the news? Which it did. Star Trek's warp drive might become reality. Yeah, quirky things make the news. Also, it's a new species discovery. It's just new discovery. So we have Star Trek's warp drive. Another thing that often makes the news is a reference to popular culture. That's a way of giving people a kind of way in to understand science. So if there's a reference to pop culture, that can get you in the news. Here's one. I'm doing a story on multiple sclerosis right now. Cluster or coincidence? Biostatistician weighs in on Elmvale Acres MS cases. So that's a biostatistician who got his name in. Basically because there was already a story in the news, a cluster of MS cases, and a biostatistician was able to give like a reply to it. So if you see something in the news that's in your area, don't just think, oh well, they don't know what they're talking about. Contact the media and put out a release and respond to it. How Canada is helping NASA retrieve asteroid samples. So that's the Canadian angle, right? NASA's retrieving asteroid samples. It's not of interest in Canada, but if Canada is doing something, then Canadians will be interested in reading that story. It makes it a little more local for us, right? So those are just some examples of how you can make something newsworthy. And as you can see, it's not too much of a stretch. I mean, those are real stories. They're very interesting. Okay. Moving on. One of the other things that I mentioned was that news should be targeted. That is, you want to send your release to the media who will cover it. And this is a tough one if you're not as familiar with the media, because you have to kind of get a sense for what kind of publications, broadcasts, websites publish things that are like what you want to talk about, that are like your research. So ask yourself first, who will find your research results interesting? Who are the target communities that you're trying to speak to? And think about that for your release before even writing it, because you're going to actually probably modify or adjust the kind of writing you do depending on who you're trying to speak to. If there's something local, it's the local media. There's been a discovery of contamination in a local river, or an unusual fungus in Banff National Park. Then there's the specialty media. Specialty media includes scientific publications, like I do a lot for the Canadian Medical Association Journal, and now I write for Nature, and they cover issues that would not be covered in the general media. CMAJ, I'm always looking for stories that affect doctors or that are about medicine or interesting medical discoveries. So this is called the trade press. That is the press that appeals to people who are in a particular profession or industry or something like that. And don't discount that. Don't overlook that, because that's an important audience to reach. For example, I do a lot of work for Canadian Pharmacists Association, and they put out press releases about research appearing in their journal. Sometimes those only get picked up by the other pharmacy press, but they're happy with that because they're trying to speak to other pharmacists and inform other pharmacists. And if they do that successfully, then they're quite happy. A lot of scientific stories are good for the very focused science media. They're good for something on Discovery Channel, Quirks and Quarks, that kind of thing. And if you've got something like that, you might want to send it to them. And then there are stories really that have such a widespread appeal that they're going to go into the general media, and you can interest somebody at the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star or, the National Post. Those aren't, that's not that often. It really has to be an unusual story, but those occasionally get some pickup there. So, my question for you, oh, sorry, didn't mean to go on, is uh, what kind of media do you think your research would interest? If you were to say, my research would be interesting to this program or this publication, can you think of one or two that might be the right kind of targeted audience for your research? If you have any ideas about that, please write them into chat. You'll find that I'm making you do a lot of spade work before you even think about doing a release. But this is the kind of thinking that you should do before you even pick up, your computer and start writing a release.
While we're waiting for folks to join in the chat box, I'll just talk about, I do some of these for Evidence for Democracy. And so we're usually looking looking at national scale issues, how's science doing in the federal government, how's science doing at that scale. So in terms of publications for us to focus on, what suggestions might you have for those big, broad ones?
Mm-hmm. So you're probably trying to target some of the national media, like the CBC. CBC, even on their web news, is very good. Probably the larger newspapers and that kind of thing. It's more difficult to get into the local media, the local newscasts and newspapers if you have a national story, because they tend to focus on local issues, but not totally dead end. Some of the local media will pick up something like that. I'm not getting a lot of response to my question about what your target media is. Even if you have some questions about your target media, just please chime in. People aren't reading newspapers that much anymore, says Robin. That's a very, very good point. So you might think in terms of web media. That's right. Very good online outlets these days. So there are a lot of web media out there. Science Daily publishes a lot of things. I go to a couple of medical sites, like a neurology site and so on, that publish press releases from universities, hospitals. I get a lot of interest there. There are regional news outlets that might pick up things of local interest or produced by local scientists. Georgia Strait in British Columbia. That's Laurent has mentioned that. That's true. Especially if there's a local angle, or you can make a local angle out of what you're talking about. It could apply in that area. Unfortunately, I've seen a lot of cases where scientists are sending releases to media that would not be that interested. These unfortunately do not get coverage. So, how do you? It's a waste of your time and energy. It's a good idea to keep a list of target media that you update very often. So my list looks like an Excel spreadsheet with the media outlet, names, email address, and telephone number of reporters. Sometimes they're not reporters, sometimes they're editors or assignment desks, depending on the outlet. In all cases, I've called them, um, asked them, who I should be sending my release to, if my releases are the kind of thing interested in. So I'm sure it's a very targeted list. So then when we've got a release, which we'll have just in just a little while, I put on the subject line media release, and then I write the headline in the subject line and put the entire release in the body of the email rather than as an attachment to email. And then I always follow up with a phone call to make sure that it was received. Unfortunately, these days, occasionally emails go into the junk folder or in the fray of other things. Nobody checks their emails for hours and it gets overlooked. So that's a good way to make sure it gets picked up. So Stephanie had a question. She says she's currently working on a drug discovery. So she thinks specialty media, something specialized yet easily accessible. And that's a very good idea. You can think in terms of specialized media concerning the disease that the drug discovery is aimed at. Most diseases have some kind of a foundation that publishes press releases. Colin points out some media outlets are beholden to special interests and thus may not be receptive to anything contrary to their philosophical position. Um, in Canada, I think that's very rare, in point of fact. Most often, the media is making decisions based on what their audience would like. And unless, the media is not deciding things based on, for example, who their advertisers are or who their funders are. So you would probably, I think sometimes scientists send out releases, they don't get picked up, and they're looking for reasons why. So the most common reason is that the reporter or editor simply doesn't think their audience would be interested. So this is why I'm telling you to target. Okay, moving on. Okay, so we've done all of our groundwork and we're ready to write a release that's going to be aimed right at the audience that we want to meet. We want to target. So let's take a look at a typical release. Now I pulled this template from a US website, so it's a little bit American, you'll notice. But I want to show you some of the very common elements that you'll see in a media release. At the top, it says for immediate release. This is because some releases are under embargo. And what embargo means is that they're releasing it to the media, but they don't want it to be actually broadcast or printed until a certain date and time. This is very common if you're publishing in a journal. The journal might release a press release ahead of time, or your university may, but they may ask that the reporter doesn't actually publish the story on the web or in print until the article has appeared in the journals. And that's what embargoes are all about. You'll notice that there's a contact. The contact is one of the most important things because a lot of media outlets require that the reporter have done an interview. So they'll put their name, company, email, phone up at the top. Sometimes these appear at the bottom of the release, so it really depends on how the release is set up. They can go in various places. Then usually you have a headline, centered and bold, or title case, upper lower case. Sometimes this is on the left. If you have a subheading, that can go there too. A lot of media releases don't have a subheading, they just have one heading. The next thing you'll see there is a month, day, year, and the location. This is called the date line. This is very news oriented kind of thing, and you will see a date and a location on a lot of releases, but I find it's going by the board. A lot of them just kind of work that into the text of the first paragraph, and so you won't see that as much these days. We'll talk a little bit about the lead, which is the first paragraph and the kind of information. And you'll notice this example is only a couple of paragraphs. Then it has a boilerplate about where the release is coming from. And that's pretty common too. It says something about the university or the organization or the hospital. At the end, you might see something that indicates it's the end, like the three hash marks, or hyphen 30 hyphen is an old fashioned one. These are also going by the board. I get a lot of releases now that don't have anything at the end, letting you know it's the end. You just, run out of things. So that's basically how it looks when it's set up, and that's how it should look when it appears in your email. Okay. Now, I wanted to tell you before we go any farther what we're going to cover. We're going to take a look at the structure of the press releases. I've talked a little bit about that, but we'll go more into what happens in the text, the headline, the lead, and the other things you can do in the text. Quotes are always a great idea. Now, before we go on to releases as such, I wanted to mention a beast called media advisories. These are to invite the media to events or opportunities to meet with scientists. So they're basically an invitation. What they do is they kind of entice you to come to the event. And so they don't tell you very much about what's happening, but try to just make it intriguing. So they don't give away the way that a media release does. It explains what happens at the event and has the who, what, and where in a succinct format. So I've given you an example here that I just Baines website about Navdeep Baines touring the Vancouver region and making an important post-secondary infrastructure announcement. So it's got the time, the location, and who to contact for more information. Right. Okay. Somebody's asked, sometimes can it be that you know a reporter or editor whom you can approach directly on a particular topic? Yes, but if you don't, I mean, that's a great idea. If you know somebody in the media, that's often a good way, because even if they're not the right person to cover that particular story, they can refer you to a colleague who is. So that's always a great idea. But don't hesitate, if you don't know anybody, to just call up the newsroom at Target Media and ask, would you be interested in this kind of media release? And who should I send it to? What's the best way to have somebody take a look at it? Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about the structure. This is kind of journalism 101. News format is called inverted pyramid, and here's a simplified picture of it. Essentially, what they mean by that is the wide part at the top is wide in terms of importance. So the most important information is at the top, and it slowly kind of dribbles down to information that is less and less important. And you'll notice that news stories generally have no conclusion. They're not like magazine stories where there's a nice little what they call kicker at the end. And there's a reason for that. In the old days, they used to cut the stories to fit the space, right? So the journalist would write the story actually too long and figuring that, it's going to get cut from the bottom, and they would make the paragraphs more and more self-contained and less important as it went, knowing that some of the bottom paragraphs would get cut off and would just kind of end. In fact, if you think about it, most people, if they're reading something on the web or in a newspaper, often never finish the story. They read about a paragraph or two and kind of move on. So this is part of the news structure. Now, one of the things that Adam pointed out that you can probably see from this is that this structure is completely unlike the introduction, method, results, and discussion structure used in scientific papers. So I teach scientists how to do both, how to write a scientific paper and then how to write the press release. And it's a real switch, you've really got to switch gears when you're moving from one to the other because it's so completely different. Essentially, your results and why they're significant are in the first paragraph. The introduction doesn't exist. Your method is probably not there. And the rest is just why it's important. So it's really very much boiling down what's in your INRAD paper. So when you write your release, think in terms of that news structure. The reason I'm telling you about it is the closer your news release is to the final media story, the more likely it is to be covered. So you use a news style. And one of the things I do a lot when I teach, like whole workshops is tell people to spend some time thinking about their key take home message and even, practicing an elevator pitch where they get it down to about 30 seconds. So let's start with a headline. This is a very good way to really, really focus. So I want you to start thinking right now about how you'd write a headline for your research. So there's got to be headline is like a small sentence, right? Subject, verb, and completion. If there's something about the source or something, it's usually at the end. You've often seen like colon study. It is no more than 15 words. Okay? So some examples of headlines. And, if you just observe some things as you're reading these headlines, and if you have some observations, just share them in the chat. What do you notice about these headlines? Moose minds of the world visit Manitoba, where Bullwinkle is in deep trouble. Smart contact lens could replace blood sugar monitors for diabetics. Canadian anthropologist investigates ancient human ancestor find in South Africa that deepens evolution mystery. Anybody notice things about those headlines that help make them work for you? Alliteration, moose mines in Manitoba. Yes, cute plays on words or turns of phrase work quite well in headlines. Intriguing, exactly. They make the reader want to know more about the subject, so they capture your attention. Now take a look at the way they're written. They're sentences without periods at the end. And you'll notice that there are no articles, no the or a. It's like all the thes and as have been taken out. Okay. We take this for granted, but it's part of how they're written. Okay. So think about your research. If you were writing a line about your research, what would it say? Let's start with a headline. This might take a minute or two, and don't be afraid to share something that's, not perfect. Oh, I think I had another headline. Yes, I did. Human ancestor Lucy's cause of death solved. I like that one because it's kind of the murder mystery, right? That's right. Laurent comments, justice at last. So if you have a minute or two, just write a headline that would tell us a little bit about your research and make us want to read. Remember, it needs a subject, a verb, and a completion. You'll notice that if something is not 100%, you're not really totally sure about it, you say could, might, things like that. That helps you in a headline as well. Somebody was working on a drug for progressive MS. New drug helps MS patients to, I don't know, tell me what it does. Evidence of corporate influence in the manufacture of doubt, says Colin. Okay, what I need there, Colin, is a verb. That's good so far as it goes. And you will see some headlines like that, but generally there's a verb. Evidence of corporate influence found, or evidence mounts. Yes, I like that. Evidence mounts that corporations influence perceptions of doubt or something like that. Anybody else have one they want to try out?
One thing I noticed, and maybe we're seeing some of that today is, as a whole, we're often so hesitant to make these declarations, to say, oh, that's very forceful to say that claim is true. We hide behind these terms of significance and certainty. So really putting ourselves out there in that way is a very foreign concept.
That's true. And I find that if you're uncomfortable saying this is absolute fact when in fact you're not entirely sure, that's where I use words like could or might or something like that to give, and people understand that means that it's not 100% proven. It's something that you're looking into. Also true in the humanities and social sciences, Laurent has pointed out. So Colin has another one. Canada's double standard on asbestos. And again, you need a verb there, Colin. You need a verb. Canada Canada says two things on asbestos. Canada sends out mixed messages on asbestos. Policy has a double standard on asbestos. You need a verb, basically, in your headline. You'll notice that there's some verbs in all these headlines. Anybody else want to share a trial headline? Oh, here's Alberto. Industrial development threatens Canadian birds. That's really strong. That you're going to get covered. New MS drug may provide patients with new options. That's pretty good. As headlines go, it's written very well. Written very well. The industrial development threatening Canadian birds, that would get picked up if you've got evidence of that. There's conflict. The MS drug, people are interested in that because, it's a lousy disease and people like to see people get better. It tugs at the heartstrings. Almost everybody knows people with MS. Rural and urban Albertans support pesticide bylaw. That's good. Or maybe, if the pesticide bylaw is not very well known, I would start the headline with a pesticide bylaw, like pesticide bylaw supported by, supported in rural and urban regions or something. Yeah, I want to avoid the passive voice. Yeah, but sometimes you have to use the passive voice. That's not it's not unheard of in a headline. I would say it's more important to try to start the headline with something pretty strong, like a very strong word or phrase. But you guys seem to kind of get the picture. So move on. Okay, now after you write your headline, you want to write your lead. So the first paragraph is called the lead. And it generally contains the 5 W's and an H. Whoops, flip back by accident. So what do you start with in your lead? You start with your key result. And you want to express that in 1 or 2 sentences, about 30 words maximum per sentence. And I try to start those sentences with the strongest ideas and words. We were rehearsing this the other day, and I suggested putting at the very beginning of a press release the words scientific integrity. That was the topic, and it's a very strong topic, so try to get that right at the beginning of a sentence. And for the same reason, I put things like dates and times and sources at the end of the sentence, according to an article published today in Nature Genetics, for example. So here are some examples of a lead. Inside a large cave in northwestern Australia's remote Kimberley region, Someone painted an elongated yam-like shape on a ceiling at least 16,000 years ago, new research suggests. That long ago creation in the unnamed cavern adds fuel to the argument that rock art in Australia goes back even earlier to the continent's first inhabitants. Now, you see, that's quite narrative and not terribly hard news, and yet it tells you a lot and it fits the format of a lead. Okay. A second kind of crow, native to Hawaii, joins the famous New Caledonian crows as proven natural tool users. Tested in big aviaries, Hawaiian crows frequently picked up a little stick and deftly worked it around to nudge out hard to reach tidbits of meat that researchers had pushed into holes in a log. Scientists report September 14th in Nature. So you can see some patterns in the way that these leads are written, right? So I'm going to give you a minute or two to start writing a lead. Maybe just the first sentence, that's enough. Just try to write a 30-word first sentence that basically gives the main result from your research. And you'll notice some of these try to also explain why that's significant, why that research result is significant. If you can work that in, great, but that's kind of bonus. So try to sit and try to write a lead that would start off your press release. If you take a look at the ones that I've put up, you can kind of do a little analysis and see where the who, what, where, when, why, and how are expressed. And that is kind of a checklist. You should go over your lead and make sure that you have all of those there.
Even just a first sentence or two would be good. It's a lot of pieces, but that checklist really is so essential. Like you said, I mean, most people are just going to read the first line or two, and that's it. If they're not hooked by then, so much for the rest of your story.
Yes, I think after each sentence, you lose a percentage of the readers. So think about it that way. The more you can kind of draw them in and keep them going, the more you're telling them about your research. So as you're, okay, we've got Colin very fast on the mark. He's got an example. Investigative journalists expose examples of scientists who prostitute themselves in the manufacture of dope to support their sponsors. Sure.
That got my attention.
I'd read that. Yeah, but probably if these investigative journalists had published a story or something, you would probably start by saying scientists have sold out their integrity and created doubt in the public mind to support their sponsors, finds a study published today in whatever, something like that. It's probably the fact that there was a study and a story in journalism usually comes at the end, is what I'm saying. Keep working on your leads, and we want to share some more. I'm just going to go on to the next, to keep us on track here, I'm going to just go on to the next slide. But please keep on those leads and share them, and we'll come back to them. Now, of course, there's a lot that you can't include in a lead because it's just basically the main result. And those are some of your cautions and caveats and exceptions and explanations and that kind of thing. And you want to put those later in your press release. So in the rest of the release should be about a page maximum, and only the very essential detail to back up your one key take-home message. Don't try to get your whole paper into a release because basically can't do it, and it kind of dilutes your message. So So I find a lot of releases are based on the publication of a scientific paper. And the key thing when you publish a paper, do explain the key results in a way that assumes the journalist cannot understand the paper. And most releases also go beyond the paper. The paper is going to be very cautious, very careful. Only the information that can be backed up by peer-reviewed science. But in a lot of releases, the scientists go a little bit beyond the paper. They talk about what it means, how it affects people, where the research will lead. So they may say, my paper found this, and I think that means this, or I think my next step in research will say this. So Collins asked a question about the level of language comprehension, and I'll be talking a bit more about that in just a minute, okay? So you're one step ahead of me. Also, if you're writing about a study, generally you don't mention the methodology. It is very rare a journalist is going to ask you about the methodology. Essentially, the public trusts scientists to have had a credible, authoritative, evidence-based methodology, and so it is rarely mentioned. Also, numbers and statistics. A lot of people are not really, they don't really learn using numbers and statistics. So I say to use them sparingly, like one or two per release, and the statistical significance, most of the public doesn't understand that. So what you talk about instead are things like strength of the result. Okay. Any more leads out there? Love to read another lead. Somebody's got one that they're working on. Don't be afraid to put it out there. As you can see, I kind of extemporaneously rewrite them, but feel free to put them out there. Let's talk about some quotes. Quotes are a really good way to liven up a media release. Quotes from scientists, including yourself, that are pithy and interesting, just add a little something. They're usually used to express views and to give a feeling of excitement or emotion from the scientist's point of view. The human aspect of a story is often the scientist and his or her reaction. Quotes are not generally used for facts. Those are usually expressed simply as prose. Okay. So I've got a few examples of quotes here. Lucy likely died quickly, said John Kappelman, an anthropologist at the University of Texas at Austin. I don't think she suffered, Kappelman said. What do you notice about that? The quote, I don't think she suffered. What does it do? What function is that quote performing? What does it make you think about Lucy and about Kappelman? Exactly. It generates empathy. It adds color in human interest. Lucy, you suddenly think of Lucy as a person, and you think of Kappelman as a nice person who cares about Lucy, right? So this is how, in the media, unlike science, the focus is people, right? The University of British Columbia sailbot team. Now, I didn't even know what a sailbot was, and I could pick it up from this context. Said that their hearts jumped, quote unquote, when they began receiving notifications again from the boat. How does that make you feel? Hearts jumped. Why is that a quote? I think, again, it's some of that human interest. It makes you feel something. Exactly. It's positive news. It reflects an emotion. It makes you think about the scientists as people who had something that had kind of gone south, like obviously their sailbot had dropped out of radio contact or something, and then they started to get something again, and they were excited, right? So you feel the excitement. When you do quote, ensure that anyone quoted has agreed to the quotes you have used and has checked them for accuracy. People hate being misquoted, and so And they get misquoted. People get misquoted by the media all the time. So don't let that be you. Okay, now let's talk, get back to the point that was made earlier about the need to write at a certain reading level. So you need clear, colorful writing in media release. So need to avoid jargon, define terms, and use metaphors. And these essentially are plain language practices, as it's now called. Now, I don't get hung up too much on what grade reading level you're writing at. There are grade reading level checkers, one's online, and also there's one in Word, Microsoft Word. But they can be kind of gamed. You can play games to try to get them to a certain level. And I use them, but only as kind of one of a number of tools. And really, I think it's more important to think in terms of terminology, length of sentences, things like that, that are going to make your writing more comprehensible to people outside of your specialty area. Avoiding jargon, overall science jargon and jargon in your field is incredibly important. Adam had some really good examples of how terminology is misunderstood. So, how do you do that? Well, first, try to use another word. So, for example, I was working on a media release recently that was all about dyslipidemia. Okay, this is a term that the public would never understand, but fortunately, I can use another term that is not as technical. So I used unhealthy cholesterol levels, right? And so therefore, people understand that. They understand unhealthy cholesterol levels, and the word dyslipidemia, which was all over the article I was writing about, never appeared in the release. Another thing to do was untangle complex phrases, right? I do quite a bit of work in forestry. So we had something about the underlying compacted mineral soil. These are called noun strings where you have just one adjective after another. So you just kind of deconstruct that and write it in a way that the public can understand, which explains it. Like the underlying soil, which is composed of minerals and is very compact and dense, right? New terms, if you can't find a different term that works, the other approach is to define a term. And people love definitions. There shouldn't be two. Is a key term that you're going to have to use in the release, then you define it. And try to define it in a very plain language, but not, you know, too dumbed down kind of way. So I was working with a scientist on a release forest fire, and it was about research involving duff. And he said, "Oh, everybody knows what duff is, but I don't think people know what duff is." So we defined it. Duff is the forest floor layer of decomposed leaves, needles, fine twigs, and other organic matter. It's working on a story about assisted migration. This refers to deliberately moving species to new, more favorable locations with the goal of helping them to survive and flourish in a changing climate. So we had to use that term, so we defined it on first use. And people like knowing key terms that they think they might come in handy and might be useful. Analogies and metaphors to explain complex ideas. I'm sure you're wondering where this is going. I read this recently and it really stuck in my head. Honeybees infected with deadly parasitic maggots that make them behave like zombies have been found in Canada for the first time. That's a fantastic lead, by the way. And the stories about the zombies were all over the place. If somebody, the person who thought of that zombie metaphor, it was brilliant. It's a play on words. It makes you think of something in pop culture. And would it have stuck in my head if they hadn't used that zombie metaphor? So Alana is asking, what's some common jargon in your field? If you can think of some common jargon, throw it out there. Here's another example of metaphors. The bacteria are equipped with a natural built-in compass needle made of iron that helps them navigate as they swim through the water using whip-like tails called flagella. So this is an explanation section of a news item, and there's two metaphors in there: the compass needle and the whip-like tails. And that gives you kind of a visual that you can imagine how these bacteria navigate around. So now it's your turn. I'm still looking for leads, so if you're still working on your lead, please put it up there. I think I'll go back to my zombies. And if you can think of some term in your field that's jargon that maybe you could either define or come up with a plain language equivalent that you could use instead, that would be really useful. So think of something like that. If something occurs to you, feel free to share it, and we'll talk about a couple of them. I'm not going to ask you to come up with a metaphor. Those are kind of harder, but Kate says, for us, it is usually explaining government departments, organizations, and their relevance, which is kind of like jargon. Yes, bureaucratic stuff is actually almost worse than scientific jargon. It's very difficult to explain. If anybody has any leads or some definitions or anything like that, feel free to share them. Avoiding acronyms, also incredibly important. That's something Kate's mentioned. In the government world, we all try to avoid acronyms. And in science, papers are full of acronyms. Colin mentions bias and confounding. Yes, I was recently in a situation where I was writing something where I was trying to explain bias, and I really had to define it. Publication bias, self-selection bias, and of course, a bias in the public's mind means somebody having uh, a partiality or a point of view or something. They don't understand bias in the sense of bias in a study, right? Statistical significance, I avoid completely. Yes, I avoid that one. Say a strong result. This was a particularly strong result. It could not have been by chance. Statistics showed it could not have been by chance, something like that. Those are always tough ones to explain. Oh, Bronwyn's got a lead. Let's try this out. A new mapping project shows the scale and extent of long-lasting mine-related environmental contamination in colonial Mexico. Wow. That's pretty good. I like that. It's a very good lead. Tells me what happened, tells me where. Oh yes, jargon, reagent. Fortunately, that's usually in the methods, and we don't even talk about methods in media release. But anything chemical, sometimes I go back to saying a chemical, a molecule called that does this. Oh, research focusing on cell biological processes. Yes, even the simplified definition can be pretty inaccessible. This is very true. It's very difficult to explain. Ooh, tiny strands of RNA that can end up as protein inhibitors. Ooh, yes. You probably can't get into that kind of level in the media release. You have to keep it kind of high level at 10,000 feet and just talk about what your new drug does and how it affects the body and how you're hoping that it will help people. But you can say that it uses a completely new method, and you can say that it attacks the disease in an entirely new way, things like that. Yes, that's a tough one. I just had I was just writing about multiple sclerosis. I'll send you my article when it comes out. I was explaining about the B cells and the myeloid cells. It's not an easy one. Okay, a few best practices to follow. There are a couple of other things you can do to make your release helpful to journalists. Full citation info, including the URL and the DOI, for the 10% of journalists who are actually going to read the paper. Okay, or a PDF of the paper available upon request or attached to the release is always helpful. Photos. Websites and print publications are always looking for photos. So if you have a good photo that illustrates your paper, and I've given some here that have recently appeared with papers, those are fantastic. Those are gold, and your story is more likely to get used if it has a photo. Another idea is a photo of you and other scientists involved. They have to give their permission, and that's another good way to give a website that's starving for visuals a very good photo. Checking and proofreading. Ensure the release is accurate. That accurate, like, oh, I think my picture cut off the E, so that's not accurate. I find great scientists who know tons about science and are very accurate in their science will make mistakes in spelling of names, the name of an organization, the telephone number, and the email address. So be very careful in these. Double read them twice. Have a colleague proofread as well, because you get too close to things and you can't see it anymore. And especially, you may have had an incorrect assumption about what the name of an organization is or something. So double check all of those. Test drive your release. Read your draft to friends and families outside your field, the people who represent your target audience. Read the draft to them. Ensure it's clear and understandable, leaves no major questions unanswered, and flows smoothly. Reading out loud is great. Reading out loud to friends, you kind of watch their face and see how they're reacting as you read line by line. And if their eyebrows start to crinkle, you know that they're not understanding. I would not ask for the advice of other scientists who tend to ask scientific questions which are not really appropriate for a media release. Now, you have to prepare to do interviews. Now, we could do a whole webinar on that, and probably will at some point. The release should have the telephone number and the email address of the person to contact to arrange an interview, because often the first thing the media is going to do is make a phone call. If that contact person is not the scientist who ends up being interviewed, explain that. And I've given an example here: to arrange an interview with Professor Thacker, contact Janice Simpson in media relations at blah, 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 because the journalist needs to get that interview, and they need to know that the person they're contacting will get them an interview and not be like a brick wall between them and the interview they need. Be very sure that the scientist and contact people will be readily available for a week or two after the release is out. Scientists have been known to issue releases and immediately disappear on field work into the Amazon. Remember that the news cycle is 24 hours and 7 days, so you have to be available on the schedule of the media. So I've done a little to-do list here which basically just sums up what we've covered tonight, and you can use that as just a checklist. Have I done all my homework? Have I made a really good release? Now, how do I send it out? And it's just a reminder of everything we've talked about. You can also hold workshops on media releases. I do workshops tailored to the various needs of scientists and institutions. I do workshops on media releases, effective science writing for the public, getting your paper into high impact factor journals. Now, there is a fee for this because I do this for a living. I am not a professor. However, brief advice and initial discussions are always free, and that's my phone number and my email address. Now, Alana, do you want to talk about the next webinar?
Sure. I just want to make a comment on that list. I just want to go back to it for a second. This media release to-do list is such a great resource. I started doing media releases about 4 years ago, and I was kind of flung into it. I had no experience whatsoever. And as you might imagine, it didn't go very well for the first little while. Getting pickup was pretty hard, and I had to learn a lot of these things by trial and error. So just having these 12 steps would have made a huge difference. I see Caitlin's asking if we'll get a copy of this presentation. Yes, I will send a link to a YouTube recording of it out to the participants.
Thanks,
So the next one, I will be offering the next webinar, and the date is wrong. It says October 30th, but it's actually November 30th, Wednesday, November 30th. I'll make sure to correct that in the slide deck. And that webinar is going to be on how to publish an op-ed. Op-ed, for those that don't know, stands for opinion editorial. So these are opinion pieces in papers, also known as the editorial pages of a paper. And this is a chance where you can represent a position or represent your science yourself without having to go through the press. And it's kind of a different tool. Maybe Carolyn, I'm kind of interested in a comment on why someone might want to use an op-ed versus a media release. I know for me,
Yeah,
one
often
big
if
thing is
something is controversial or it's sorry, we just have a slight delay on the line. Yeah, I was saying if something is controversial or there's a point of view, you might want to do an op-ed rather than just a media release about your results.
And another one is this point that you talked about the timeliness of media releases, how it's for newly published research or research that's relevant because of other news that's happening. If there's a position that you want to discuss or something that you really think needs to be public knowledge, but it's not timely, it's not something emergent, it's not a big story, that's an op-ed is a good venue to sort of get that out. So for example, one of the first op-eds I ever published was about light pollution. There were no news stories about light pollution. No one had released a new study on it. I was just walking outside one night and I said, I can't see any stars, and that's kind of a shame. And I think not many people really know about the problem of light pollution. So I pitched a magazine. I said, hey, can I write a piece on light pollution for you? And said yes. And it wasn't related to any kind of news, but I still felt it was something that the public needed to know. So I'll talk in the next webinar about how you do that, how you get that published, how you structure that. It'll be a similar sort of deal. People can bring their research to it, and we can workshop it together and even start working on some drafts of op-eds that you might want to publish somewhere.
Yes, and Colin's asking about op-eds usually appearing on the editorial pages. In newspapers, they usually appear kind of there's usually a page with editorials and possibly letters to the editor, and usually the page across from that is all op-ed. It's all opinion and columns and that kind of thing. And magazines often have a section with shorter pieces with people's names on them that are, kind of opinion or kind of oddball little writing pieces. And think in terms of what the journalists need. Newspapers and magazines are always trying to fill those space with really interesting material. And yes, in some cases, magazines especially, they will pay, not well, but they pay.
Definitely not well, but yeah, they can. I find it's a mixed bag. About half of them, I kind of write the pieces and I say, I think this is important, let's get this out there. And I'd say about half the time they say, just, $25 for your trouble, but it's not very common.
So we just want to open this up before we wind up. Has anybody had any experience with releases? And would you say, from your experience, would you say any do's or don'ts, or is there anything from your experience that you'd like to share that you found worked or didn't work, or that kind of thing? Anything you'd like to do? And then we're going to have a few minutes for questions, any final questions, and then we're going to wrap up.
Also, at this point, if you do want to use your microphone, you can raise your flag and we will unmute you if you want to share a story or ask a question using audio.
So you can use chat or you can use audio, whichever you would prefer. Thank you, Colin. Colin says he thinks the guidance is right on the button and he's sorry it wasn't taught it years ago. And I think that's one of the problems is with the specialization, and the lack of interdisciplinary knowledge is that scientists learn science, communicators learn communication, and it's only those of us who happen to have stumbled on both that end up doing science communication.
I also wish I had learned it, in my professional career. But I'd be curious, as we open this up, sort of open up the floor, maybe we can also proceed to questions as well. I know we have some young scientists, young professionals on the line here too. Have you ever received any of this training before? Does your department provide this training? If you wanted to learn these skills, is there somewhere that you can go for it, or is it just not available? I'm curious to hear from you too.
Mm-hmm. So any comments based on your experience or questions for myself or Alana? Stephanie says, if it's available, it isn't publicized. Caitlin says, definitely not available in our department. You have to search or perhaps it's not even available. It's hard to know, eh? Are you going to try to do a media release on your next research publication?
And certainly, if you are considering a media release, feel free to get in touch with myself or Carolyn about it. We're here to help.
Mm-hmm. So Stephanie hopefully will, and she certainly got a good, interesting project that would be of interest to the public. So, and Colin has helped to do his releases, and is planning to send out some releases. So that's fantastic.
Okay, well, I think perhaps we're getting near to the closing time, so I'll just kind of wind it up, and then we can stay on the line with questions or further comments if people want to keep chatting. We can unmute anybody who'd like to keep chatting. So I just want to thank Carolyn for delivering this webinar for us. Carolyn, your experience is invaluable. You are one of the best positioned people in the entire nation to be speaking to us about something this. You have a really incredible wealth of experience. And thank you for volunteering your time to share this with us. I really, really appreciate it. And to everyone that was here today, thank you for coming. I know it's the evening for most of you and taking time out of your evening after work. I hope you got something out of it. I will send a follow-up with a recording, and I'm also going to send a short survey that just if you have any suggestions for improving it or to see how you felt about the webinar. I also want to thank Kathleen for setting up and running this whole thing and being here, making sure that there were no technical difficulties. So if you want to keep the discussion going, there's our email addresses, and feel free to stay on the line and keep chatting through the chat box or raise your flag and we can unmute you.
Yes, I'm going to stay around for a few minutes just in case anybody has any questions. And if you're thinking of a release now and want a few opinions, we're here to help you out.
Yeah, if you're thinking of writing one, this is a great chance to workshop it. Certainly, last chat with Carolyn, I think I just spouted words about science integrity, and she just wrote my next release for me in about 25 seconds. All right. Well, thanks for coming, and I guess for those that are signing out, I guess hopefully we'll see you at the next one.
Good luck with your releases.